Mindful eating interventions offer a promising approach to counteracting the pervasive influence of ultra-processed foods, but their effectiveness and the urgency of their implementation varies dramatically across age groups. The overconsumption of highly processed foods is not merely a matter of choice. It is deeply embedded in physiological, behavioral, and environmental systems that start shaping eating patterns in childhood and become progressively harder to alter with age. While strategies like portion control, nutrition education, and behavioral therapy can help, their impact is limited if they are introduced late, inconsistently applied, or unsupported by the surrounding food environment. The reality is that without early, sustained intervention, habitual overconsumption of ultra-processed foods can lead to metabolic, cognitive, and cardiovascular consequences that are difficult to reverse, creating a silent but relentless erosion of health across the lifespan. In children and adolescents, mindful eating interventions must address both biological and behavioral vulnerabilities. Young brains are highly sensitive to the reward signals produced by high sugar, salt, and fat foods, and their prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control, is still maturing. Portion control and structured meal planning can reduce the immediate risk of overconsumption, but without education that fosters awareness of hunger and fullness cues, children may continue to eat for external reasons, such as emotional comfort or peer influence. Behavioral therapy, often in the form of cognitive behavioral strategies, can help teach delayed gratification, self-regulation, and emotional coping that does not involve food. But these approaches require consistency and reinforcement at home and in schools. Failure to implement such interventions early can lead to entrenched neural pathways linking ultra-processed foods to reward and stress relief, making overeating habitual by adolescents and predisposing teens to insulin resistance, obesity, and metabolic syndrome. For young adults, the challenges shift from developmental vulnerability to lifestyle pressures. College students and early career adults often face stress, irregular schedules, and limited budgets, all of which promote reliance on ultra-processed foods. Mindful eating interventions at this stage focus on teaching self-awareness during meals, recognizing hunger and satiety signals, and reducing distracted eating, such as consuming food while working or using screens. Portion control remains critical, but behavioral therapy must also address emotional eating, stress management, and habit restructuring. Without these interventions, young adults may continue overeating out of convenience or emotional need, and the cumulative effects, weight gain, worsening insulin sensitivity, and elevated inflammation, begin to solidify. The risk is that by the time metabolic issues emerge in middle age, many individuals have already experienced decades of dietary patterns that reinforce overeating, making later correction more difficult. Middle-aged adults face compounded physiological vulnerabilities that make mindful eating interventions both more necessary and more challenging. Resting metabolic rate declines, insulin resistance often begins, and hormonal regulation of hunger and satiety, particularly leptin and ghrelin signaling, becomes less responsive. Nutrition education can help these individuals understand why ultra-processed foods lead to overconsumption and how to adjust portion sizes, but without addressing behavioral triggers, stress, emotional coping, habitual patterns, the physiological and psychological pull of these foods remains powerful. Behavioral therapy, including cognitive restructuring and mindfulness training, can slow overeating, improve food choices, and help reestablish a connection between eating and actual hunger. Yet the longer a person has relied on ultra-processed foods, the more deeply ingrained these neural and behavioral patterns are. Without aggressive and consistent intervention, middle-aged adults are at high risk of progressing toward obesity, metabolic syndrome, and cardiovascular disease. In older adults, mindful eating interventions are complicated by both entrenched habits and physiological decline. Satiety signals are naturally weaker, digestive efficiency is reduced, and chronic health conditions may constrain dietary choices. Portion control remains essential, but it is not sufficient on its own. Behavioral therapy and nutrition education must be tailored to address cognitive decline, mobility limitations, and social or emotional factors that drive overconsumption. For seniors, eating ultra-processed foods is often reinforced by convenience, taste, and the familiarity of long-standing habits. Interventions that fail to account for these factors risk limited adherence. When ultra-processed food consumption continues in older adults, the consequences are particularly severe: accelerated metabolic deterioration, increased inflammation, heightened cardiovascular risk, and greater susceptibility to cognitive decline and frailty. Across all age groups, mindful eating interventions face the challenge of counteracting decades of behavioral and physiological conditioning shaped by ultra-processed foods. While portion control can reduce immediate energy intake, nutrition education can increase awareness of healthier alternatives, and behavioral therapy can address emotional and habitual triggers. The efficacy of these strategies diminishes the later they are applied. Early and sustained implementation is critical because once overeating behaviors are reinforced over years, particularly through hyperpalatable processed foods, the neural pathways, hormonal adaptations, and behavioral patterns become deeply entrenched, making change far slower and less complete. Moreover, environmental pressures, ubiquitous advertising, easy access to ultra-processed foods, and social norms that normalize overconsumption can undermine even the most dedicated interventions. The warning is stark. Without early, comprehensive, and reinforced mindful eating strategies, the overconsumption of ultra-processed foods can set individuals on a trajectory toward obesity, metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease, and cognitive decline that becomes progressively harder to reverse. While interventions like portion control, nutrition education, and behavioral therapy are essential tools, they are not sufficient if the food environment continues to favor ultra-processed foods and if intervention is delayed. The longer the exposure, the more resilient the neural and hormonal patterns of overconsumption become, and the greater the cumulative toll on metabolism, immunity, and overall health. In short, mindful eating interventions must be proactive, sustained, and adaptive across the lifespan, or the long-term consequences of ultra-processed diets will continue to escalate unchecked.